Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we attempt to emulate the Greek gods on the Mount Olympus, giving a judgment far above the passions and the foolish squabbles of mere mortals. But it is a bit foggy up here, and so we can't guarantee that we'll be completely objective, but we try. My name's Mike Pierce, by the way, just in case you've forgotten that, because I had. Right.
I think at this point anybody's likely to guess that we'd be in London or something with all of the mention of fog, but neither of us are.
It hasn't been foggy since the Clean Air Act of 1958, I think. But anyway, there we are. Sherlock Holmes has a long afterlife, I know.
Right. Well, today's episode is the third and final in our mini-series, and that we're calling If I'm Catholic or Atheist or Jewish or Muslim, what did the Reformation ever do for us? And today's topic is on its impacts on the economy and commerce around the world.
Right. Well, Protestantism really did change things in the economies of those countries that became Protestant, and because of necessary emulation, then others had to follow in their wake or be overwhelmed. So it's worth looking at the features of Protestantism that encouraged commerce and trade and a whole load of skills around it that tended to boost the economy. First off, we should mention, of course, lending money at interest.
Now, we actually touched on this subject before in our first series on the Jews. It's like an Old Testament restriction on lending at interest, right?
Right. So, and it says that you should not lend at interest to your brethren. And so having Jews around was handy because the Christians weren't brethren to the Jews, nor the Jews brethren to the Christians. So the Jews could be employed in money lending and then blamed for their wickedness in lending money at interest. But there weren't enough of them. In any case, they kept being kicked out of one place for another for reasons that we discussed in that series. And we do urge you to look at the second episode in particular in that series about this subject. But if one's not allowed to lend money at interest, one probably isn't going to lend money at all. And that, in the long run, maybe even in the short run, but certainly in the long run, is going to act as a serious drag on the economy. Now, pre-modern people, and even in the Reformation era, the people in the Reformation era didn't think in terms of the economy at all. That wasn't part of their conceptual thought world. But we, at least looking back at them, can see that that's what it did. And the reformers, Luther not so much, but Calvin rather more, gave permission for lending money at interest and interpreted the Old Testament texts about this in a rather fast and loose fashion, really. But to say that all it really meant was that you shouldn't charge extortionate interest. Well, who's to say how much that is? Because that will vary from time to time and place to place. But in territories that became certainly Reformed and Protestant more generally, there was a permission for lending money at interest. And that had the effect of boosting the economy, of allowing enterprises to happen that otherwise wouldn't have happened.
How much would the Protestants have adhered to Jewish laws and customs? I mean, now I feel like we sort of can easily sweep those aside and say, well, that's part of the old covenant. But was that something that was particularly important to them, are sort of upholding these Jewish customs?
It varied. If I wanted to throw stones, which of course I never do, we might say that they tended to pick and choose. They certainly took, especially the Reformed, took a view of the continuity between the two covenants, the Old Testament and the New, rather further than the early church did.
Oh.
So yes, it will have varied. It will have varied. secondly is the abolishing of saints' days. Now, the number of saints' days had proliferated during the course of the long Middle Ages. And of course, there are just the 365 and a tiddly bit days in the year. And by the time we get to the late Middle Ages, most of them were celebrations of one saint or another. And a lot of people, especially if they were rather lazy, were inclined to celebrate all of these holy days as holidays, right? So Protestant reformers considered that celebrating saints in this way was superstitious and tended to get rid of saints' days, again, more in those territories that became Reformed than those that became Lutheran. And after 1600, at least amongst Puritans in England, there was a corroborating emphasis on the sanctity of the Sabbath. Puritans didn't particularly take a strong line on this until around the turn of the century. And from then on they did. So those listeners who've come across very strict ideas about what can and can't happen on a Sunday, this comes from there, later Puritanism.
Maybe now is a good time to remind us exactly who the Puritans were.
Right. Okay. Well, Puritans were those people within the Church of England, not outside it, within it, who wanted to purify, hence the name, purify by their own lights, the Church of England from the remnants of Catholic ceremonial and so on. Now, they never did quite succeed, but they were very active. What we should say is that this tendency towards getting rid of all the old holy days and having an absolutely regular 52 weeks a year Sabbath when no work happened helped to create a more predictable commercial rhythm of work, which will become even more important up the road when England starts to industrialise. That's still over the horizon in, say, Elizabeth's reign or James's reign. But it is there. So it's a kind of a work discipline. The other thing that went along with it that tended to make Puritans unpopular was that traditionally after church on Sunday, people would go out to the village green and play games and sports and practice archery and dancing and go and have a beer and all this kind of stuff. And the Puritans took a very, very dim view of that. Nothing except holy exercises was to happen on the Lord's Day. So that tended to make them unpopular.
So is this really where we see the origin of like the 7-day work week or the standard 7 days in a week?
Well, there'd always been the 7 days in a week. I mean, the days in the week are named after Roman gods. The idea that it was 6 days of work with one day off, rigidly adhered to in that sense. Yes, I think it does come from this period. I mean, the third point that we need to make here is, and we mentioned this in our previous episode, previous episodes rather, that Protestantism encouraged literacy. This was the religion of the book, the Bible, rather than the institutional church, ceremonies, mass, and so on. And the central act in Protestant services was preaching from the Bible. And so literacy became a religious duty. So partly Protestantism is predicated upon literacy, it presupposes it, but it also encourages it amongst people who are not literate. And that, of course, is going to have a big effect on people's ability to conduct business, keep records, and so on. Fourthly, we should mention the idea of calling, vocation, Latin vocare, to call. This is the idea that all lines of work are something that God has called people into, and that they're just as important as being, say, a parish minister. And this is Luther's idea of the priesthood of all believers. Now, we should pay a little attention to this because, in my experience, people wave this phrase around today and they mean something very good by it that I agree with, but they invoke the authority of Luther, and it's not what Luther meant at all. What tends to be meant by this expression today is that all Christians are priests, correct, and therefore a whole load of them may be qualified to preach. All sorts of people can celebrate the sacraments pray out loud, and so on. Right? And I'm not disagreeing with that at all. But it's not what Luther meant by the priesthood of all believers. He meant that all professions, all lines of work were sacred to God. And that it was a religious duty to throw yourself into your line of work. If you're a baker, then bake to the glory of God and do the very best that you could.
This is coming back around into fashion, I would think, in Christian circles. I've heard more than a few people mention this as being important. So sort of
Okay, well,
nice to see that again, I guess.
this is news to me, but I'm pleased and delighted. I know my good friend Mark Green spent most of his career leading up the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, and this was the centerpiece of everything that he had to say to people, encouraging them along these lines and encouraging clergy to stop implying that the work you do during the week is kind of secondary importance because the real business happens in church. And it's saying that's nonsense. This is no way to go about anything. It's also no way to go about evangelism. If your workmates feel that you're only there simply to get some money and etc. And I think he felt quite a lot of the time that he was banging his head against a wall, but I hope he wasn't. Okay, well that's good. Well, the reformers also lay an emphasis upon stewardship. The parable of the talents, the coins, is expounded along the lines that you need to give an account for whatever it is that God has given you, whether that's resources, money, or talents in our sense today, whatever it is, abilities. You need to make them more profitable than they were before. And so all of these things are creating a certain kind of workish and commercial ethos. Similarly with charity in the Middle Ages and still in the Catholic Church even after the Reformation, the ideal of charity was that you give alms to beggars or to this poor person or that poor person, somebody who's destitute. And the Protestant reformers tended to sweep all of this away as being inefficient, as perhaps giving money to people who didn't need it or might waste it on booze or something, and instead replaced this with organized charities that gave relief to the poor or started schools or hospitals or other social enterprises like that. And that whole idea of the institutional charity really comes out of Protestantism in this period. But the biggest contribution, perhaps, is something that we noticed at the end of last week's episode. And it was accidental, not intended by the reformers at all. In several key Protestant areas, the monopoly of a single church couldn't be made to stick. Now, I want to reiterate something we've said before because it's a false idea but hangs on so tenaciously in many people's minds. The Protestant reformers never wanted religious toleration. They wanted to replace the Catholics' wrong church with their own right church, right? And then couldn't agree on what the right church was, as the Catholics predicted, right? But in several key areas, that kind of monopoly couldn't be made to stick. We noticed in last week's episode how that was true in the Netherlands and why, right? And in the following century in England and the American colonies, the same thing happened. And religious pluralism bred commerce and intellectual curiosity. If people are free to make up their minds, unofficially or officially, about the most important thing in life, they tend to feel free to make up their minds about a whole load of other things, including their work life, their intellectual life more generally. And that tends to foster this kind of creativity and economic dynamism. Well, a few minutes ago we mentioned usury, the sin of lending money at interest in the Old Testament. So we should at least briefly touch base with what those texts are. So in Exodus 22:25, if you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not be like a moneylender, charge him no interest. And Leviticus, if one of your countrymen becomes poor, do not take interest of any kind from him, but fear your God so that your countrymen may continue to live among you. You must not lend him money at interest or sell him food at a profit. And Deuteronomy, do not charge your brother interest, whether on money or food or anything else that may earn interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but a brother Israelite, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you put your hand to, but not a brother Israelite, excuse me, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you put your hand to in the land you are entering to possess.
These are the direct texts where this idea of usury comes from,
yes,
as you mentioned.
Yeah, usury is the term. It's a sin, and it means lending money at interest. Now, C.S. Lewis, when he was being mischievous, liked to point out that the whole of the modern West and its economy is built upon one thing that the Bible tells you quite clearly not to do, namely lend money at interest. To be entirely fair here, there is a huge difference between lending money at interest in a very basic pre-modern economy, where most people have no access to a choice in anything, in their supplier of anything, including supplier of money, and therefore are very vulnerable to being ripped off. And where the only reason that most people would ever want to borrow money is because their crop failed and they're in danger of starvation, right? Those people are very vulnerable. And it could well be argued, in fact, I think it should be argued, that that is what this is concerned with. Old Testament Israel was not a thrusting, dynamic commercial economy. It was pretty bog standard for the pre-modern world. Whereas for us, of course, it's very different. If you think that the bank is charging you a rip-off rate, then you can go and move your loan to someone that doesn't do that. They're competing with one another for your business. The whole argument gets morally tricky when you start to examine the switchover from the first situation to our situation. At some point, right, there's going to be something like the first situation prevailing, but somebody charging interest.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that the rates that most credit cards companies charge is pretty much a crime.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I think the credit card companies, like a number of other big businesses, have the legislature basically in their pockets, so there's not a lot that can happen. The number of times I found when I was in the States that there were various services that I wanted, and one time I wanted a phone connected to my house. This is before the universality of smartphones, you understand, and we had this long conversation. And at the end of it, they wanted my credit card, and I didn't have a credit card. They wouldn't actually take money I had, only money I didn't have. And so they refused to supply me. The field is fixed. This is not a level playing field somewhere, because at some point, the credit card companies have the politicians in their pocket. Well, anyway, end of rant. Moving swiftly on. What about the connection then between Protestantism and capitalism? Now, two of the most influential books in this field were published in the first half of the 20th century. The first one by Max Weber in 1902, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And then in 1947 by R.H. Tawney, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. And both of them argued for a strong correlation between the spread of capitalism and the rise of Protestantism, especially Reformed Protestantism. Now, their argument has generally been considered persuasive, and certainly I'm persuaded, but it's not quite clear-cut. You could counter Weber and Tawney by pointing out that their ideas neglect the crucial and economically powerful Italian city-states, which remained Catholic.
Yeah, exactly. There are those of us who were brought up to think that the North Italian city-states like Venice and Florence were the most economically advanced parts of Europe.
As indeed they were. So that's a good point. And yet they weren't tempted to become Protestants, right? Protestantism did occur in Italy, but it was very, very marginal. I mean, a tiny number of people. The best explanation I've heard from that is that before the Reformation, in the decades, maybe the century or so, before the Reformation, Many of those Italian cities, trading states, had religious fraternities in the towns, which engaged lots and lots of ordinary lay people in them. So the kind of religious tide of enthusiasm that was growing in Europe in the centuries leading up to the Reformation, there was somewhere for it to go. So if you were a Catholic in Florence or somewhere, and you were pious and wanting to be active in your faith, even if the local clergyman was corrupt, all was not lost. There were things that you could do. There was a place to go. And that kind of absorbed a lot of that energy. But the real riposte to this is that those cities, the Italian cities, declined relative to England and the Netherlands and so on during the Reformation period. This is the time when the states that were becoming Protestant started to really grow economically and the Italian city-states to become less powerful.
Yeah, meaning that it was Protestantism that gave the English and the Dutch the edge.
I think that was a crucial part of it. But there is something, again, to be said on the other side of the argument we should mention now. The reply to that, in turn, is that the rise of the English and Dutch and the decline of the Italian cities were due to the discovery of America with its huge resources, which gave the advantage to Atlantic-facing states. And conversely, the descent of the Mediterranean, where obviously the Italian city-states had to trade, into an arena of perpetual and terrifying warfare against the Ottomans. Right? The Mediterranean was a very, very, very scary place in the 16th century, as an array of Christian states held the North Shore, southern Europe, and the Ottomans held the South Shore, North Africa, and the Levant, what we now call Palestine or Israel, and Lebanon, and what we now call Turkey, and we're advancing up into the Balkans. So there were appalling sea battles and massacres and galley slaves, ships landing and seizing villages overnight to become slaves, all this kind of thing. So the ability of Italy, Italy wasn't a country, of course, the Italian city-states, most particularly Venice and Genoa, which were the two most important, to trade to the Levant and from there across Asia, that all was rapidly in decline during this period. So, yeah, points to be made in either direction.
I feel now thoroughly confused. I mean, what are we supposed to conclude from all of this really ambiguous evidence?
What we're really supposed to conclude is that the past was just as messy as the present, and not to come across with too strident an interpretation of the historical evidence simply because you have some kind of case, particularly an ideologically or religiously driven case that you want to make, right? The evidence is conflicting. I would say, however, in favour of Weber and Tawney, that the evidence on balance does point in favour of what they are telling us, but it's certainly not completely clear cut. Now, Marxists wanted to take the Weber-Tawney argument a whole lot further. So, according to them, Protestantism was the creed of the commercial classes, sanctifying their values, as opposed to the social pyramid, feudalism, of traditional agricultural economy.
Why is it that Marxists would favor this kind of an argument, though?
Okay, well, we need to remember that Marxists are philosophical materialists. They think that matter is all that exists, and that therefore in human affairs the economy is all. Everything else, religion, ethics, culture, art, are what Marxists would call superstructure on the fundamental reality, which is people's economic interests. So all the other stuff is just a way of expressing their economic interests. And these rationalists of all flavours are absolutely terrible at this. And all of us can be rationalists if we're not careful. That is, we want to say to everybody else, you guys only think you're thinking, but I'm really thinking. Right? You guys have actually got motivated reasoning, but you're not recognizing it or not admitting it. But I see things as they really are. Right? So, and Marx is a classic case of this. But they do have something to be said in their favor. Let's think about this now. The, the Middle Ages in the West was dominated by a feudal pyramid in society. Emperor or king or prince, depending on what our state is, at the top. And under that, major barons, and then below that, lesser barons, and then down to knights and squires. And at the bottom is baldric, the peasant. Baldric is a reference to Blackadder. If you don't know what it is, you're probably better off. But anyway, right. So the peasantry at the bottom. And what is the appropriate religion for this society? Well, Catholicism, with its summit in the Pope, going down to cardinals and archbishops, going down to bishops, to archdeacons, down to parish clergy, priests, right? And Baldric again at the bottom, right? And even in the later Middle Ages, there's a kind of a literary, pseudo-philosophical underpinning for this. The idea of the great chain of being with God at the summit and cherubim and seraphim under that, and archangels down to angels, down to human beings, all the way down to earthworms, right? And so the church is a reflection of this great chain of being in the heavens, and the social pyramid reflects the church and the heavenly great chain of being. And the Marxist comes along and says, bunkum. The whole thing is a pyramid landholding scheme in which the king owns all land and sublets it to barons under him, who sublet it to barons under them, all the way down to the bottom. And so that's the economy. And so the social reality reflects that, and then you project all of this into an imaginary heavens. And then come the Reformation. Where does the Reformation pick up? In the growing towns and cities, because there is now something out in the economy outside of that feudal pyramid, which is commerce, which produces a new thriving commercial merchant class, and it's getting bigger all the time. And so they want to not get rid of the king, but to sideline or to trim his authority, to replace it with their own elected representatives in parliamentary bodies of various kinds. And the religion they favour basically has a church that gets rid of the Pope, and in most systems, archbishops and bishops. And so it truncates that hierarchy and reflects the social reality. And so Marxists argue that Protestantism is the creed of the commercial classes. It reflects commercial values, all the kind of things we were just talking about a few minutes ago, and sanctifies them as religious duties. Now, in the second half of the 20th century, the enormously influential Christopher Hill argued this strongly and in great detail in respect of 16th and 17th century English Puritanism. And E.P. Thompson, another Marxist, subjected the 18th and 19th century Methodism during the Industrial Revolution to the same kind of treatment. So here are their two of their most famous books. And I was brought up on this stuff, and my last 2 years in school and then in university, and boy was I intimidated by it, because that was the academic establishment.
Basically, what the Marxists are saying here is that they're agreeing with Puritanism in the sense of what it does for the economy.
Only in an ironic sense. Yes, in an ironic sense. Clearly, Marxists are opposed to capitalism, although, of course, I say of course, most people don't realise this. Marxists actually approved the coming of capitalism, but then once it was there, they wanted to overthrow it, because they saw capitalism as an advance on the agrarian society before, what Marx called the idiocy of rural life. Right? But then once it's there, to overthrow it. Yeah. But the Marxist analysis like this dominated history teaching in schools and colleges in the 1960s through to the 1980s.
Yes, so you're saying during the Cold War, against communism, that university humanities departments were dominated by Marxists?
Yes, they were. It's an absolute disgrace, right? An absolute disgrace. That's not to say that all of the professors were Marxists, but they were extremely numerous and the most influential. And even those that weren't Marxists felt the need to kowtow to them at least somewhat. Now, I'm pleased to tell you that both Christopher Hill and E.P. Thompson lived just long enough to see the collapse of communism. I have rather a lot of Christopher Hill's books, most of them bought when I was in school or in college. But one of his later ones, published just as communism was in free fall, was about John Bunyan and his church. And it was unintentionally hilarious because he was still wanting to maintain all the positions he'd spent a lifetime upholding, even though it was falling down around him. So he kind of had to recant and make a sort of, but nevertheless, kind of argument at the same time. It's a good job that nothing like that is true of universities today, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Well, bringing ourselves up to date a little. So, concerning the Protestant work ethic, Max Weber noted a century ago Protestantism was a form of Christianity that encouraged hard work. And just as importantly, Neil Ferguson, who's an important historian today and not remotely Marxist, comments in his book Civilization, the West and the Rest. You see, I wasn't the only person to steal Huntington's phrase for the title of my own book. Right, he points out that reading and saving were also crucial virtues in Protestantism. It isn't a coincidence, Ferguson says, that the decline of religion in Europe has led to Europeans becoming now what he calls the idlers of the world, while the more religious United States has remained hard-working. Interestingly, he also argues that China's embrace of hard work is partly because of the spread there of Protestantism.
Yeah, but we're not so sure what the situation of Christians is in China now as we were a decade ago, are we?
No, because China has been closing up and it's started persecuting Christians again. What we saw in the late 20th century and the beginnings of the 21st was a huge boom in Christian numbers, which may have got to as high as 50 or perhaps even 100 million Chinese. What we've seen over the last decade is a clamping down. I'm not sure what to make of Ferguson's argument. I think it is very possible that this boom in particularly Protestant Christianity contributed to a rising work ethic in China. I'm not sure about it, and I'm sure other people could push an argument in a different direction. But if we look beyond China to the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia are a minority in all of those countries, and in all of them, they dominate the economies, and most of them are Christian. So, for example, if you see now and again in Indonesia, anti Christian riots are frequently the same thing as anti Chinese riots, and vice versa. And again, they are very diligent, economically, very commercially successful. So, he probably has a point, but it's not a slam dunk, I think. Well, let's consider other aspects of the Protestant work ethic. Understanding of the parable of the talents. God will demand an account of the talents, whether coins in the New Testament sense or talents in our sense, that he has entrusted to you. That was very, very prominent, very frequently preached on in Protestant countries, particularly by Puritans. The importance of literacy for Bible reading, which is also very handy for keeping accounts and business records and sending letters over significant distances, something you don't really need to do if all you do is subsistence farming, right? But for commerce, it's very necessary. The idea of calling, vocation, as we've said, something for all trades, not just clergy. And this is a point that Weber and Tawney focused on, the Calvinist notion of chosenness and of prospering the elect. Now, most people are aware of this, but for those who aren't, it's worth pointing out that in the Calvinist view of things, God predestines not simply to save those who are in Christ, but predestines which individuals will be part of the in Christ. In fact, he makes everything that happens. Well, very reasonably, a lot of people wanted to know, well, how can I know whether I am one of the elect? And the answer in a lot of preaching and pastoral counseling was that if you exhibit these signs in your life, that's a good sign that you are probably amongst the elect. And one of those is that you're working diligently in your trade and prospering. Right? It's not a very attractive sort of a notion, but it seemed attractive at the time.
This isn't like 16th century prosperity teaching, though.
No. I suppose it kind of opens the door to that, but in fact, that door was not gone through until the 20th century. And then not generally under, to be entirely fair, not generally under the auspices of Calvinist churches. No, it wasn't quite that. Again, for those who don't know about this, prosperity teaching today is, sort of, well, God wants you rich, name it and claim it, and if you have faith, then, you can be rich and all this kind of appalling garbage.
Usually the kind of stuff that you hear on TV.
Yes, that's right. Some preacher in a fancy white suit screaming into a microphone. No, that's not what this is. But it was giving people the idea that they need to examine themselves and their consciences to see if they are among the elect. And one of the signs might be that there will be fruit in their lives, and particularly that God will be prospering them in their chosen profession. But more generally, not just the Reformed, but more generally amongst Protestants, the enhanced sense of conscience. This is the point really at where the Reformation had come in with Luther. The idea that as you look inside, you might be living out the moral law externally, but inside your heart is a morass of sin, and that needs to be dealt with because God sees that. And you need to bring the inner person into conformity to outer appearance, and so to become someone who's worthy of trust. And trustworthy people are honest people, and trustworthiness and honesty are absolutely vital for commercial relationships. Now that this is all decayed all around us, and that kind of integrity understood in that sense are rare commodities these days, I don't think we could ever become as prosperous as we've become if we weren't there already. We are cruising on the accumulated and diminishing capital of our ancestors.
Right, because the way that things used to be, this would have worked in reverse. Like you had a greater sense of morality to the people around you that was more important than who you were supposedly on the inside. Whereas now I think we've reversed that, right? Where like who I am on the inside is more important than people perceive me to be.
Yes, yes. Just cruise through the feed on your chosen social media, and you'll come across 100 memes along those lines in the course of a single day. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's just terrible. Yeah. Okay. Now, just to finish then, Protestantism changes people's way of thinking about the material world, the world of business and commerce, but the material world generally. So, on the one hand, it wants to say that material objects don't convey spiritual benefit. On the other hand, it wants to say that they're not harmful either. Let's deal with the former. So, Protestants want to say that bread and wine do not physically become the body and blood of Christ in communion. They want to say that the water of baptism doesn't cleanse you from original sin. They want to say that saints' relics don't convey grace. There's no point in going to see a tooth of St. Ursula or something. Right? Neither does going on pilgrimages, nor do shrines. That venerating religious images was in fact idolatry, that grace was to be found only in inner transactions with God, the kind of thing we were talking about a moment ago, the kind of the inner world being transformed. And Augustine's doctrine of the invisible church was re-emphasized.
Yeah, and remind us what the invisible church was supposed to be.
Right, well, the invisible church is an idea that really begins with Augustine. Actually, he did get it from a Donatist who he was trying to persecute. But anyway, it begins effectively with Augustine in the early 5th century. And that is the idea that because Augustine, was certain, as Calvin was, that God had chosen which individuals would be saved, you couldn't possibly know who they were. Right? So he wanted to distinguish between the outer church, the institutional church, which everybody had to belong to because they were forced to, and the invisible church, known only to God, which was in a way more important. Now, Augustine said that you couldn't even know about your own salvation. The reformers went a little bit further than that, and they said that you could know about your own, but not about anybody else's. But it had the same practical effects as far as the church was concerned. You couldn't have a believer's church because you couldn't know who the true believers were, only about yourself. So the invisible church doctrine got a new burst of life from the Protestant reformers. Again, downgrading, at least somewhat, the status of the institutional church. Well, if material objects couldn't convey spiritual benefit, neither could they convey spiritual harm. So the reformers tweaked Augustine's doctrine of original sin to remove the sexual component. In Augustine's view, I was going to say Augustine's conception, but that would be unfortunate terminology. In Augustine's view, people are born in a state of damnation because they're sexually procreated. So that's the meaning of original sin. Lots of people nowadays don't realize that, but that is its meaning, right? And so sex was a tolerable evil, which is what Augustine thought it was, within marriage, if it leads to procreation. Whereas the reformers wanted to say, no. They wanted the doctrine of original sin, but they wanted to remove the sexual component. They didn't want to say that sex was intrinsically wicked.
But they did believe in original sin, so they had to have some idea of where it was coming from.
Well, they are very, very, very unclear on that for the first 50 or 60 years. But after the death of all the leading reformers, the second generation of reformed leaders came up with the idea of covenantal headship. But also before that, they had talked about imputed sin. So just as Christ's righteousness, in their view, was imputed to believers, so Adam's sin was imputed to people generally. But the later Reformed went further and said, well, this is because Adam is the covenantal head of the human race, right? Which, and yeah, if you're narrowing your eyes there, as you may well do, it's not entirely clear, is it? I mean, Augustine's idea, no matter how repulsive, at least is comprehensible. The other one is like straining up, sounding awfully abstract and legal. But they were abstract and legal, which is why peasants were very, 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 very slow to pick up on all of this stuff.
It also sounds like it gives Adam a lot more credit than he's due, but that's just my opinion.
Yes. Well, but this is all part of the Protestants wanting to say that material objects don't convey spiritual harm. So riches were not, as they had been in medieval piety, a danger to the soul. They might even be a sign of God's blessing. City and commercial life were not morally and spiritually tainted, as medieval preachers had insisted. Medieval preachers went on and on about this. They thought cities were terrible. They were frightened of them because people were more anonymous in city life, as we still find, and therefore under less moral constraint. People mingling together, making their living from trade, which was considered inferior to manual work on the land, and so on. So the Protestants blow all of this stuff away. Secular callings were not, in the Protestant view, an inferior way of life to being a priest or a clergyman. And separation from ordinary life, monasticism, they taught, was a false spirituality. So they have a more positive view of the material world, even though they want to insist that it can't convey spiritual benefit. And taken all together, that is kind of rationalistic.
Yeah, in contrast to all of this, the especially Catholics would have been a lot more on the other side of the spectrum, which is like superstitious isn't the right word, but asceticism and monasticism was really important to them because they were so more or less afraid of the material world.
Yeah, certainly the first half of what you said, yes, yes. And I think nervous about the rising urban society. I mean, the crisis, the absolute crisis of the Catholic Church is still 200 years up the road. But when it comes at the time of the French Revolution, I mean, it creates a century and a half of absolute nightmare for the Catholic Church, which it doesn't finally resolve until the 1960s. So, but that's still on the horizon. Catholicism was really more appropriate as the faith of a pre-modern, agricultural, hierarchical society. And it's confronted with the reality that it's going to have somehow or other to reinvent itself. And that reinvention doesn't become fundamental until much more recent times. There are a couple of halfway stages.
So, in some ways, the Reformation was inevitable because the Catholic Church had to modernize.
Ah. And that makes the Reformation inevitable. Some kind of religious change was certainly inevitable. Yes. Whether it had to take the form of Reformation is another matter. Maybe the Catholic Church might have reformed itself sufficiently to accommodate the changes that were going on in the 16th and 17th centuries. I'm not sure, but I suspect that a couple of hundred years up the road, the kind of crisis that did occur would probably have occurred anyway. Well, the quintessential commercial society, Protestant commercial society, is the Dutch Republic, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, and its new booming city of Amsterdam, which, for reasons we explained in the last episode, became actually multi-confessional because the Dutch Reformed Church simply could not enforce itself on the entire population. But that multi-confessional character actually contributed to Amsterdam's enormous success. In fact, in the first half of the 17th century, the majority of all the books printed in the world in any language were printed in Amsterdam. So you can just imagine, to look no further than printing alone, the incredible economic injection that's going to give that society. And just to finish off here, here's a picture of the Hendrik de Keyser Exchange, which opened in 1611 in Amsterdam. It did deal in commodities as well as stocks and shares, but it still counts as the first stock exchange in the world. So we look at the big stock exchanges today, whether in London or New York or Frankfurt or Tokyo, Hong Kong, and they all need to look back to this one. This was the daddy of them all. Yeah, thriving in the kind of commercial environment encouraged by Protestantism.
I guess I should be grateful because my husband works for a company that's involved in the stock exchange to some extent. So
right.
It's helpful for us.
Well, there's an awful lot of things that are fundamental to our whole way of life as individuals and as societies that wouldn't have been there were it not for the Reformation. Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm not a huge fan of the Reformation. I'm not a huge fan of the Reformist theology. And I'm very unwilling to identify as Protestant for reasons I outlined in that first episode of this series. But nevertheless, we need to confront historical facts. And Protestantism, it didn't set out to transform the global economy. Most things that happen in this world happen as the law of unintended consequences, but that was one of its effects. And we're still living with that today. Okay, so that kind of wraps it up for what we're doing with this series. And next week, we'll be back with a brand new series looking at apologetics, although we're not calling it that. The title is If Jesus is the Answer, You Better Know the Questions. So until then, everybody, thank you for staying with us. If you like this, please do repost it to your social media, and if you don't, repost it anyway and tell everybody why you hated it. And please do comment. We always like to hear from you. Well, especially for saying nice things, which does happen sometimes. And we will look forward to seeing you again next week. So goodbye now.